Breaking news. Armchair General's latest rallying cry is "Call Putin's bluff." We who are against British and NATO involvement in the Ukrainian conflict are frequently assured that the conflict cannot possibly escalate. Putin may threaten to use nuclear weapons in retaliation, but he will not actually do so. In an article this week, Simon Tisdall of The Observer repeats the claim while criticizing U.S. Vice President Joe Biden for being too indecisive and praising Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. Given that the Western press portrays Putin as a brutal and deranged war criminal, but don't worry, he's just bluffing, Tisdall writes. It's a remarkably insouciant view of Putin. Surprisingly, the United States has been slow to provide weapons despite having already given Britain $37.3 billion in arms since the Russian invasion last year. That doesn't account for the transfer of Abrams tanks, the instruction of Ukrainian military personnel, or the agreement to teach Ukrainians to fly F-16s. Unfortunately, it's never enough for those who want to take the war to its absolute limit. Liberals who support war but shun talk of peace must either grossly understate the scale of the arms transfer to Ukraine, which is truly staggering, or else pretend that Russia will not or cannot respond. The variety of unofficial workouts is also admired from afar. The assassinations of Russian political figures on the right are celebrated without regard to the consequences. This includes the missile attack on the Kremlin earlier this month, which was likely carried out by Ukrainian forces acting unofficially but claimed to be a Russian false flag operation by some politicians. The Freedom of Russia Legion, a group of pro-Ukrainian Russians led by a fascist and equipped with American weapons, made a dramatic incursion inside of Russia. History is rife with examples of such events leading to broader conflict, which would undoubtedly lead to more calls from liberals to send arms. The stakes are too high in Ukraine, which, as I argued last week, is also intrinsically linked to the Indo-Pacific with the growing threats to China. It's highly unlikely that Ukraine will achieve a decisive victory in the upcoming counter-offensive, so the only other option is a ceasefire and peace talks right now. This shift is itself political, as these phrases have become taboo in Western political discourse, where they are seen as naive and pacifist at best and an apology for Putin at worst. Knowing that if the counter-offensive fails, even partially, there will be growing calls for peace talks from a number of European governments and also from the US as another election year looms, Zelensky is touring the world demanding more weapons and characterizing those who don't agree with him 120% as helping Russia. This is the reasoning behind the current calls for more offensive weapons. Instead of supporting their own governments in the arms race, socialists and imperialist countries should recognize this for what it is. This is especially true in Britain, where the government is at the forefront of calls for increased military spending and, by the end of the current fiscal year, will have spent an unprecedented £4.6 billion on arms. The left, which is already critical of issues like NHS spending, environmental degradation, and the demonization of refugees, simply won't criticize this policy area. The war's political background is essential to comprehending it. Any other strategy would amount to closing the blinds on the growing threat of war on the international stage and the role of the major powers. This issue has caused friction between the left and labor unions. Those Ukrainians who don't buy into the narrative that their government is acting in their best interests by prioritizing the welfare of the country's citizens are in a minority, and that can make things difficult. There are, however, two reasons why this discussion must be continued. It is becoming clear that the United States and its allies are ready to wage war on two fronts at once, one in Europe around Ukraine and another in the Pacific, where military alliances are growing to counter China. It's more difficult to explain the second reason. Weakening working-class politics by aligning with our own government over the war is an obvious danger. Because of their subservience to their own ruling class on this issue, organizations representing the working class are constrained from taking any initiative of their own. That makes them more vulnerable on other fronts, and lest we forget, we are up against the most brutal, corrupt, and vicious Tory government in living memory. A government that allows sewage to be dumped into seas and rivers, rewards landlords and profiteers, and refuses to improve the standard of living for the poor is not one worth supporting. Is it realistic to think that it cares about Ukraine's right to self-determination and solidarity? The leftists who support arming Ukraine, however, want us to believe just the opposite. When you back your own government on this issue, you strengthen their hand on other issues by not criticizing their actions, making it more difficult to win over strikers. Military might, national pride, and political scapegoating provide virtually all of the government's support. The strike wave that began a year ago has slowed down somewhat. Unions have not yet proven that they can effectively counteract the government's multiple challenges, including wage restraint, more repressive anti-union laws, cuts in public spending, and repeated assaults on working conditions. With the current level of industrial action, we shouldn't be seeing a decline in union membership as we did last year. Keir Starmer's Labour Party is staunchly neoliberal and pro-war, and if elected to power, it would pursue policies that hurt working people. After failing miserably to counter Tory policies, the TUC has decided to support Starmer's revision of those same policies. In order to win and fortify our organization, the working class movement needs a serious discussion and strategic orientation. Military spending, support for war, and strike activity all undermine the movement as a whole. This week, I'll be joining a delegation to Downing Street on Wednesday to advocate for a ceasefire and peace talks regarding the conflict in Ukraine. Then, on Friday, I'll be giving a talk at the Engels 200 conference in Eastbourne, a little late due to lockdown but promising nonetheless.